move on to our next speaker, Commissioner Eastman.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I think I was invited here probably more because of the period I spent between my two assignments at the Energy Commission. As you know, I was the Executive Director from 79 to 83. Before I came back as a member of the Commission in 2002, I spent 19 years in the bond markets as an investment banker. And I think the perspective that you were looking for from me today was focused on the business environment for these plants, in addition to my current role, where for the last year and a half, my firm has provided legal representation to the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility before state agencies. Full disclosure, when I left the Commission in '83, I worked originally for a firm called First Boston, which later became Credit Suisse. They put out a very important report in the securities markets at the beginning of this year, pointing to the economic dilemma that some of these aging nuclear plants face in today's electricity markets. And to sum that up, it's what you read about in terms of the very low price for natural gas and the radically changed assumptions in the United States for the long-term persistence of that low price natural gas. According to Credit Suisse, they're looking at sustained cost inflation in the nuclear plants at 3 to 5% a year. And that creates negative cash margins for most operating plants during off-peak periods. And in Credit Suisse's definition, off-peak was 50% of all dispatch hours. UBS came out with a similar report, also beginning of the year, a little more precisely focused on merchant plants. And here, I think you get a pretty quick appreciation of the context which Ted Craver faced at San Onofre. UBS's problem with merchant plants was focused on competitive market prices between $31 and $55 a megawatt hour. Well, even if songs 2 and 3 had operated at 90% capacity in 2012, they would have produced electricity at $57 a megawatt hour. That's because of the need for a regulated plant to fully account for its authorized revenue requirement. And as a consequence, you step down from that, both units operating at 90% capacity, to Unit 2 successfully operating alone at 90% capacity. You end up with a cost $114 per megawatt hour. Now, we all know Unit 2 wasn't able to operate during 2012 after January 31st, but the repair plan for coming back at a 70% output level, assume a 90% capacity factor during that period of trial operation, you're at $163 per megawatt hour. So from a commercial operation standpoint, this repair strategy never really had much of a future, especially if you're trying to amortize all of your repair or replacement costs during the 9 years left on the San Onofre license. The energy information.
Just real quickly, so those numbers would include the amortization sort of built into whatever power production would have been produced? Or
no, those
so those would be in addition?
Purely revenue requirement.
Wow.
No projection for cost inflation. Now, importantly, 2012 gas prices, 2013 gas prices have come up as much as by 100% some markets. As you see on this slide, that's not fully reflected in the competitive price of power. according to EIA, on a weighted average basis. That means in those hours where the trades were the greatest, the SP15 cost $35 a megawatt hour in 2012. Remember, that's compared to a perfect San Onofre at $57. 2013 through the end of last month, you see prices have come up. They haven't doubled. Natural gas prices have doubled between 2012 and 2013. Electricity prices in either market region of California not come up quite as much. Based on Platts, if you look at 2012, assuming both units operating at 90% capacity factor, in SP15 there were only 6 16-hour blocks when those trades would have cleared the market. Say what you will about Ted Kraber, he's got very sound business judgment. Now, this is focused principally on merchant plants, and there is, of course, the notion that, well, the regulated plants, they don't really face that competitive pressure. I can tell you from the perspective of the guys that trade their bonds or that underwrite the debt portion of their capitalization, that sooner or later, it's that market price that is your benchmark. The regulatory system is not going to prop up a plant that is wildly out of the market. Is there any reason to think that these same forces don't apply to Diablo Canyon? And I recognize that the role of the Energy Commission statutorily as the state's energy contingency planner. I know one of the first rules of contingency planning is you try to minimize the potential for surprises. It's a lot easier to plan around a non-surprise environment. And I would suggest to you today that there's no reason to think that the economics at Diablo Canyon, despite its admirable running history, can't collapse just as quickly as they did at San Onofre. My great-grandmother used to say, it's a wonderful life if you don't weaken. I looked that up on Google the other day. It turned out that that was a slogan for the troops in World War I. It might be a good aphorism for utilities that own nuclear power plants today. You heard a lot this morning about the seismic environment at Diablo Canyon. And I was at the State Lands Commission last year when they did approve the 3D high energy seismic surveys. Each of the State Lands Commissioners observed, you know, this is probably the last place in the world we would put a nuclear power plant if we were siting it today. And I think as you look at this map and you watch the progress of the seismic surveys that PG&E is performing, in many instances at the direction of your two commissions, you got to ask yourself that question. Would we do the same thing from a siting standpoint today with the knowledge that we have? And for what I'm about to show you, I want to make certain that your record picks up. I am indebted, or my client is indebted, to the California Public Utilities Commission. 37 or 38 years appearing on your transcript, and I see Commissioner McAllister looking at me with surprise. I've not had many opportunities to say nice things about the Public Utilities Commission, so I don't want to miss this one. Administrative Law Judge Thomas Pulsifer granted my client's motion to compel discovery, and as a consequence, I think we've learned a lot that we didn't know a short time ago about how PG&E has responded to information concerning the shoreline fault. This is from the NRC's reaction to PG&E's shoreline fault study. PG&E's final study had been published in January 2011. Of course, between January and August, the Fukushima catastrophe happened. But the NRC staff in August of 2011, quite critical of PG&E's approach, and in fact, was prepared to write them up for a fairly significant license violation. It went on to indicate that the so-called double design earthquake. It was more limiting, largely because of its conservative damping assumptions and its conservative assumptions about soil structure interaction. The double design earthquake, even though it's associated with an earthquake of smaller magnitude than the Hasgri, the double design earthquake is actually a more demanding set of licensing requirements. And the NRC staff in August 2011 quite insistent that simply comparing shoreline fault information to that developed in the LTSP was not going to be sufficient to meet the license requirement. How did PG&E respond? This is a series of internal emails my client has gotten through discovery at the PUC, and the reference there in the first one is to Dr. Michael Peck, who was the senior NRC resident inspector at the plant. And I should note that on September 9th, 2010, the San Bruno explosion took place. The morning of September 10th, Dr. Peck started asking questions about whether you could meet the safe shutdown earthquake criteria that had now been put in a different light with information surrounding the shoreline fault. Dr. Peck has said that beginning in September 2010, the NRC staff knew that the shoreline fault, the Los Osos fault, and the San Luis Bay fault all could produce ground motion 70% greater than that which had been assumed in the double design earthquake. Dr. Peck has also indicated that PG&E corroborated that in December of 2010. You see the September 20th email. That is what I would characterize as a former regulator, a red flag. A greater chance of having to shut down. This is an economic issue, not a safety issue. Goes on to suggest that as early as September 2010, PG&E recognized that there was an insurmountable problem in meeting the criteria associated with a double design earthquake. And I want to emphasize the primary reason for that insurmountable difficulty was the conservative damping assumptions and soil structure interaction assumptions associated with that test. The Diablo Canyon license carries 3 separate design basis earthquake tests. 1, the design earthquake, 2, the double design earthquake, and 3, the Hasgri earthquake. They all have different damping assumptions. But from a compliance standpoint, the licensee is supposed to be able to meet each and every one of those tests. In October, the reality, I think, becomes fairly clear. The Hasgri probability, you heard a lot about probabilistic seismic analysis this morning. The Hasgri probability is so small that simply relying on that would mask the issue in what this October 1st email calls PRA space. I should say with respect to the bottom quote, CLB stands for continuing license basis. Dr. Peck obviously made a bit of a pest of himself. He continuously pursued the notion that the shoreline information needed to be evaluated based on the double design earthquake criteria. The double design earthquake is specified in the license as the safe shutdown earthquake. PG&E attempted to say that no, using the LTSP, which is more modern, more probabilistic, is a much more sophisticated approach. Dr. Peck clearly wasn't buying this and suggested that the NRC staff in NRR, which I believe is nuclear reactor regulation, had been misled by earlier information that the LTSB was actually part of the license. January 2011, remember this is still pre-Fukushima, PG&E offered what I truly think is a sincere approach, that there is a difference between safety and licensing compliance. And I am not prepared to question the sincerity of those that think applying other tests than the double design earthquake can still provide for a safe facility. In fact, I asked this question to Dr. Robert Budnitz at the Diablo Canyon Independent Safety Committee last week. And he told me that, you know, he didn't want to address license compliance. That was not within his remit. But he had personally satisfied himself that the plant was safe, that the equipment can adequately perform. That may very well be, for all I know. But I can tell you that we operate in a system of the rule of law, not the rule of men. And the only way in which our system can work is if the terms of licenses are objectively applied. When I was here at the commission, I was the presiding member of the siting committee. And I know how difficult some of those siting cases can be. We authorized 23 power plants in the 5.5 years I was here. And you develop a compliance program with respect to every license. You don't ask the inspector to exercise his personal judgment as to whether something is safe or not. You ask the inspector, was the license complied with? The license needs amending. Change the license. There's a process for doing that. But you don't have ad hoc judgments take precedence over what the license actually requires. PG&E, first instinct, I think legally the correct instinct, was if you don't want to do the test, amend the license. And that's what produced the August 1st write-up by the NRC staff. PG&E was, I think, quite candid in their November 2011 10Q. And I think from a regulatory standpoint, you know, in the hierarchy of credible information coming from utilities, the very top of the pyramid is that which their securities lawyers review before it's disclosed to the market. This bottom bullet is, I think, the pertinent point, because the stakes are very high. The NRC could order the utility to cease operations until modifications are made, or the utility could voluntarily cease operations if it determined that the modifications were not economic or feasible. And I want to tell you what I heard from Dr. Munson this morning was pretty disconcerting in that context, because what I heard, consistent with what Dr. Peck was saying as early as September 2010, was that the NRC staff doesn't expect these 2015 evaluations that PG&E is going to be doing to be able to satisfy the double design earthquake standard. Now, that's a pretty long period of forbearance from enforcing the requirements of a license. And I think from the standpoint of your contingency planning responsibilities, you probably ought to get to the bottom of this information, get the information from PG&E as to just how broad an exceedance is there between the shoreline fault information, the Los Osos fault information, the San Luis Bay fault information, and the double design earthquake. If you don't get that information, how else are you going to have a handle on the prospect of a sudden shutdown? The next section of this, I think, is even more troubling. It's PG&E's notes, and I'll tell you as a lawyer, they're hearsay. They're not evidence that the branch chief, Neil O'Keefe, actually said this. What they are evidence of is this is the way PG&E wrote up the call report. And from my perspective as a former regulator, I think it verges on what I'd characterize as inappropriate coaching. His advice is that we eliminate the double design earthquake as our safe shutdown earthquake. His opinion is that by leaving it in, it appears as if we are covering something up. I'll tell you, that's a red flag. The simple story won't stand on its own if we leave the double design earthquake in. Neil's greatest concern is that we cannot provide a good argument for why the analysis using the double design earthquake can't be done. He made the comment that it is better to be legally clean than legally correct but confusing. I don't think I ever saw anything like this when I was at the Energy Commission, either as its executive director or as a member of the commission. I can't say the NRC and its licensees have the same culture that we had, but I think from the standpoint of the state of California, it should be a matter of profound concern. Even after the call, that persistent Dr. Peck continued to stress his view that PG&E cannot use the alternate analysis method. Now look at this. If he is correct, and that means if Peck is correct, and we can't use that approach, we have to apply shoreline using the double design earthquake approach, that would almost certainly result in exceeding code allowable limits that would require us to get NRC approval to continue to operate. Dr. Peck graphed the difference between these damping assumptions. I'm sorry that the graph is difficult to read. It comes from a non-concurrence filing, meaning that he was dissenting from what became the NRC management's position. And I have to tell you, that's a relatively rare event to have your senior resident inspector dissenting from what management decides to do. This is his graph of the containment building at I think the 88-foot level. His point in the narrative of his non-concurrence is this is where the air coolers are that the facility depends upon in mitigating a loss of coolant accident and main steam line break. Neil O'Keefe was Dr. Peck's supervisor. This is how he responded to the non-concurrence. The actual facts are not in dispute. While this concern has overtones of safety, the actual questions are procedural. Well, from a procedural standpoint, it's hard not to regard this lengthy period of forbearance from license enforcement as a de facto license amendment. And those of you familiar with the ASLB decision on San Onofre know what a large role the phrase de facto license amendment plays in determining whether there's a right to public hearing before that type of change is put into effect. Under the licensing provisions, the state of California is supposed to be consulted before that type of change is made. There is a lot more to this story, which my client will address in the testimony it will be filing in PG&E's general rate case on June 28th. I will also submit that to your docket and would be happy to respond to any questions.
Well, thank you. Obviously, I was going to suggest PG&E respond in writing, since obviously you different snippets here, at the dates when the comments are due, as opposed to trying to respond, at this moment. I guess just sort of shifting gears for a second, obviously you're trained as an attorney and also in the securities area. And so one question we're struggling with is when we look at the economic damage that occurred in Japan and try to figure out the abilities of anyone to deal with that type of magnitude of event. Is that something that's ever discussed in the financial disclosures?
Well, it's akin to both the liability insurance that in this country goes under the Price-Anderson rubric, or the responsibility for waste disposal, permanent waste disposal, that is absorbed by the federal government. These are sums that very quickly get to such large magnitude that they're passed off to the taxpayers because there's really no other way to do it. So as long as those legal provisions exist, or as in a wildfire or flood, Hurricane Katrina type situation, if your contemplation is, well, of course the government would have to step in to address that. From a securities analyst standpoint, that's an easy risk to jump over, not try to quantitatively evaluate, discuss it qualitatively, depending on your perspective, either lament it or celebrate it, but don't dwell on the numbers too closely because they quickly cascade.
Thank you. Commissioner, any other questions? Preview and coming attraction.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, that was a interesting play-by-play, and really appreciate all the digging on that. Obviously, I think there's a lot to discuss there. So in this moment, I don't necessarily want to dig into it, but I certainly feel like that the sort of dynamic, I asked about it before a little bit with respect to, does our regulatory structure kind of capture the ability to work through these issues in a fairly, relatively, responsible, transparent way? And I would want to kind of, keep that discussion alive in the sense that PG&E and the Commission, the NRC, consider sort of a little bit of procedural analysis in comments to this proceeding or in another adequate proceeding. So thank you. So let's see, I think this session is scheduled to go to 3:50. So let's go to Mr. Lamb and then see how much time we have at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
A few minutes. Honorable Commissioner McAllister, Honorable Chairman Weissmiller, Honorable Commissioner Florio, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, good afternoon. I am Peter Lamb. I am the chairman of the Buchanan Independent Safety Committee. I am honored and privileged to serve as the California Energy Commission's appointee to the Buchanan Independent Safety Committee. May I share with you today some opposing arguments about nuclear reactor safety. And I frame my discussion today as the causes and consequences of major nuclear reactor accidents. Now, this slide illustrates our previous estimate on accident frequency to be about 10 to the minus, over 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 5. It's about once in 20,000 reactor years of operation. That means within this country, we would not expect a single nuclear accident because we had only 104 nuclear power plants before Singapore proposed shutdown. However, within the last several decades, we do see 3 major nuclear accidents: Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima. With that data, the new estimate now may be, you see the question mark there, once in 2,000 years. What does that mean? That means, do we expect to see a nuclear major accident every 5 years? Because now we have about 450 nuclear reactors operating in the world. And even with only 100 nuclear reactors in this country, with a once in 2,000 year frequency, we are talking about a 2% probability of a nuclear accident happening for a plant within its 40 its lifetime. Now let's talk about successes here. How do we so far prevent nuclear accidents? These two slides are really self-explanatory. For those of us in the nuclear safety business, we really practice application of fundamental safety principles of redundancy, diversity, and physical separation. We pay attention to design, manufacture, installation, operation, and maintenance of critical equipment. There's a robust federal oversight. There are continuing licensing regimens. And we have industrial group participation, international cooperation, state agency involvement. An example to be given is the Diablo Independent Safety Committee. We have 3 committee members. We have 3 appointed authority. The state governor of California appoints 1 committee member. The state attorney general appoints another one. And the state of California Energy Commission appoints another member. And then we do have continuing operational experience analysis and feedback. Now let's talk about causes and compounding factors, which is a diplomatic way of talking about failure. You are looking at a complex and unforgiving technology. You are dealing with intricate system interactions. You're talking about numerous human and machine interfaces. You're talking about safety systems with large capacity on standby. Means the system are basically idle until you need it. When you need it in a hurry. And these are large systems. You're pushing against the envelope of the limits of law of physics. And then you talk about equipment unavailability and failure. This relates to equipment aging. Each and every plant in this country it's almost middle age. You talk about average age, about perhaps 20 years old. And then you talk about human errors, errors of omission, errors of commission, in operation, in repair, and in test. And then we're talking about design basis, beyond design basis external events. Oh, okay. And then you talk about numerous potential accident initiators. And how about many vulnerabilities? How about unpredictable accident sequences? And then, last but not least, what about unknown and unknowable developments? Within the federal agency that regulates nuclear power, used to be an impermissible attack on agency regulation if you talk about malicious acts. And the agency's own criteria was unforeseeable events. Now, of course, after 9/11, the landscape had changed. But still, the last bullet is important because there are things that we may not know and be able to predict. Let me show you a typical picture of a two-loop pressurized water reactor, courtesy of the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You see a pristine structure. You see a simple, elegant design. Right? It tells you this thing works. Another picture also conveys the same language. Yes, indeed, to the proponent, nuclear technology has served us well. We have not had a major accident that had caused any human fatality, including Fukushima. No member of the public had ever died from a major nuclear accident. So this technology has served us well, to the proponent. Now, this is a 35-year-old picture from my NRC training manual. Now, at that time when the picture was drawn, a steam generator, you see 4 steam generators there. The cost of a steam generator was about $5 million at that time. Today, the steam generator at San Onofre costs about $100 to $250 million. Now, what about the the consequences. But this slide is self-explanatory. For truly nasty, major nuclear accident, you are dealing with potential human fatalities and latent health hazards. You will be looking at immense environmental impact from radioactive material releases and dispersion. You talk about huge financial burden. And then you talk about long-term post-accident management for years or decades. Why? Let's look at radiation hazard before we go to the next slide. You do talk about large inventories at the reactor core or the spent fuel pool or at the dry gas storage site. You talk about lethal doses. You talk about different pathways. You are talking about some very long line isotopes. And then some radioactive isotopes, they act like potassium or calcium to the human body. If they act like calcium, it will go to the human bones. Potassium will be widely dispersed in human tissue. Now let's talk about lethal doses. The last item on this slide is referring to the Greek figure of Medusa. Medusa is one that you look, you die. Now, the lethal dose to 50% of the population is roughly about 500 grams. So grams is a unit of measurement of doses to human body. It's stand for rodent equivalent man, because men come in different sizes and shapes and gender and age. Now, about 500 grams will kill 50% of the people who are exposed to it. That's what LD50 means. Now, the contact dose of a fresh, brand new spent fuel, now the fuel has been sitting in a reactor core for maybe 3 years, 4 years. If you remove it from the reactor core, the contact dose is about 1 million grams per second, or 10 million grams per second. Okay, within a split second, we deliver thousands of times more lethal dose to human beings. Now let's talk about decay heat removal. In any accident consequences, you deal with those, and then you deal with the decay heat. The simple illustration here is about long-term decay heat is less than 0.1%. For major nuclear power facility, you're talking about, you're turning on about 1,000 kitchen ovens. And within the confined space that you're dealing with, that heat needs to be removed. And what's the problem? The problem is you're facing two fundamentally conflicting technical demands. To release the decay heat, you need to open the system. To contain the radioactivity damage to the environment, to your fellow human being, you need to close the system. And then you need to do that for years or for decades. And then you need to do that to be really successful, you need to move people away. And then you need to deny them the land use. And then you need to find money. Now, the policy consideration here is, one, is compliance along with federal regulations sufficient? Two, do federal design basis accidents cover all the important accidents? Now, this is an important consideration here. In performing my duty as the chairman of the Independent Safety Committee in Diablo, in response to public inquiry, some of my responses is framed this way. I, for one, am persuaded that Diablo can comply with all important federal regulations. That I can testify to that. But under federal regulation, adequately develop and implement, that is another matter. Now the third point is, it's a technical analysis that the experts have done. Are we complete? Now in this business, completeness is not only important, but it's difficult. For anybody who had ever tried to do accident analysis, you talk about numerous sequences, you talk about unpredictable development, you talk about material science, and then you talk about physics, and then you talk about thermohydraulics. You truly talk about multidisciplinary effort here. once in a while, here and there, maybe some of the analysis are not complete. And most of the time, that incompleteness is okay, it's rather trivial. They are relevant, but they're not material to the outcome. But are we persuaded that all the time that we have complete analysis? And then are we making realistic assumptions? Now, may I give you 3 examples on adequacy of federal rules? Number one is the 2011 earthquake near Mineral, Virginia, impacting North End nuclear power plant. The forces experienced by the facility had exceeded both the operating design basis and the design basis earthquake. So it really exceeded the OBE and the DBE. Now the proponent's argument is, little equipment damage was observed. And indeed, that is a good demonstration of large safety margin of how we design equipment. The opponent's argument is, gee, where were you guys when you put the design basis earthquake together? Why did you set it so low? The next example I'd like to offer you on adequacy of federal rules relate to the pressurized thermal shock rule. Now, I, for one, consider the pressurized thermal shock accident one of the major accident sequences that deserve our undivided attention. It has nothing to do with Fukushima. It has been on our books for years. Now, in the old NRC rule or the PTS rule, there were seven nuclear power plants were not eligible for license renewal for another 20 years. The new rule, which was developed after decades of intensive research, it's been offered to the licensee. It's not mandatory, it's voluntary. You don't have to choose it. You don't have to comply with it. But if you do choose to comply with it, would now make all nuclear power plants in this country eligible for an additional 20 years of license extension. Now, the proponent's argument would be, hallelujah, this is a clear demonstration of elimination of unnecessary overly restrictive federal rules. It demonstrates a more realistic assumption on neutron damage to the reactor vessel. The opponent's argument would be, well, I don't care about who is going to be eligible for license renewal. The new rule obviously introduce a relaxation of safety margin. And of course, this standing assertion on the table that the new rule may be politically motivated. It just came out in time. And then the third example of federal rule adequacy had to do with something in Japan. Now, everybody is aware that the Japanese nuclear industry had been using most of our regulatory framework and system for how they regulate the nuclear power industry, not to mention the design of General Electric, the design of Westinghouse reactors. Now, near Suruga Reactor Unit 2 was just recently discovered. Now, I cannot testify to the validity of that discovery because I only read it in the UPS News article, that the reactor Unit 2 was sitting on an active seismic fault. Now, assuming that is factual, then I'm proposing to you the proponent's argument would be, oh, don't worry, the plant's been sitting there for so long. A major seismic event would be unlikely. Besides, one can always develop effective remedies. Now, the opponent's argument would be, hey, for decades, you cite a plan there and telling us it was safe. Now, if I may also offer you an entertaining question, is as much as I have a great deal of respect and admiration and a great deal of deference to our seismic scientists and engineers and who practice this trade for so long and try to protect the safety of the public and among many other things. Well, in my humble opinion, the seismic science is not at a mature state to be able to answer this fundamental question. If you know so much about seismic activity, please tell me when and where and how big the next earthquake will come from. I give you plus minus an order of magnitude leeway on the prediction of the size of the earthquake. I give you plus minus 10 miles from the epicenter. This is just an assertion that I hear numerous times in our public meetings. And now may I conclude my observation on accident prevention, as we all are working towards making sure the existing power plants are safe. It's not only prevention of recurrent accidents. As much as I, again, respect and admire the effort being done on Fukushima, to me, it does not give me comfort if you tell me I'm no Fukushima. I'm 88 feet, I'm 200 feet above sea level. I do everything that would safeguard a station blackout. My concern is on the second support on the first one, which is what about new nuclear accidents or not? By new, I mean they have not occurred, and God forbid, let's make sure they don't. And some of these accidents have been on our books for years. If I may offer you one example or two examples, one is to have to do with the pressurized thermal shock. It's a nuclear reactor vessel rupture. If it ruptured, it would present a very difficult situation for anybody to manage that accident. Now, admittedly, every single licensee that I know in this country are on top of it. We have coupons in the reactor vessel, we test them, we extrapolate, we interpolate, we have numerous people focusing on it. But my urging is, let's make sure we're doing enough. And the second one would be an other reactor accident that's on everybody's book and in everybody's mind is, well, what happened to a nuclear reactor if you need to scram it and it does not scram? Right. So my urging is, let us do what we are doing on post-Fukushima lessons learned. Once that is done, if we have any energy left, perhaps we refocus our attention to preventing something that has nothing to do with Fukushima, but has everything to do with nuclear power safety. And then the second bullet is what I had offered to you for consideration of adequacy of federal rules. And then the post-accident management difficulty are really well known and they're self-explanatory. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Just a comment, I guess, you know, we've had from various angles, we've had a relatively pragmatic discussion, I think, about the particulars of the plants we have here in California, looking at the various regulatory kind of processes that are in place, the studies, the technical. You know, I liked the way Mr. Lamb set up sort of what, on the one hand, on the other hand, what the proponents would say and what the opponents would say about any given issue. And I think it does highlight the fact that this relatively difficult to understand or complex set of issues really doesn't get pretty quickly back to individual worldviews. What you think about this in a lot of ways boils down to what you feel like our society ought to look like in order to support a technology like this. It boils down to kind of philosophy. Maybe we should have a panel of you know, philosophers to help us work through some of these issues. But the fact that you have a highly complex, very technical, inherently centralized technology, and you can say that about the electric grid sort of generally, but you can particularly say that about nuclear, is, I think, you know, France has chosen one route. You know, the U.S., kind of, we have a different nature to our democracy in important ways. And I think people apply their feelings about what kind of society they want to live in onto this question. And it brings up a lot of really fundamental, almost existential questions and issues, and I don't propose to have the answer to them, but I do feel that at a, your presentation, I think, can help us kind of understand what the choices we make and where those might be leading us, which fork in the road we take at any given issue, or any given point along this discussion, could have long-term impacts on the kind of systems we need to put in place to mitigate risk, and the costs that we're imposing on society, the kinds of structures we need to put in place, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to put that out there to elevate the discussion a little bit, to say, this is not necessarily about just about relays and backup systems per se. This is really kind of I think a very fundamental discussion in important ways. So we're obviously not necessarily talking about that here today to figure out how we're going to move forward with particular plans regulation, but I think it's worth saying because this is actually it has to do with what your vision of what the electricity system ought to look like, and we do have limited options, and I think it's really good to work through this when we have the opportunity. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, just a follow-up question. I was thinking back, obviously as a nuclear scientist, I can say that a lot of us spent a lot of time thinking about the implications of our research, both in terms of bombs and also in terms of some of the challenges of nuclear power, which people like Ivan Weinberg, certainly a leader in this area, always talked about sort of the Faustian bargain there. But anyway, getting more to prosaic issues. My recollection is that one of the Diablo Canyon reactors has copper weldments, and so the PTS issues could be relevant there. Is that true?
Yes, indeed, Champion Vice Miller. And not only it's relevant, the plan has been focusing on that, because the Independent Safety Committee's inquiry recently, and they have been focusing on it for a long time.
No, I remember before Diablo started operating, PG&E was starting to come to grips with that, the copper weldments at that stage.
Right, and their coupon program has been very adequately planned and implemented. And based on the latest, I was on site a month ago. My inquiry has to be, the general features of the plan, but specifically there are some coupons that has been extrapolated to 60 years of fast fluence exposure. Assuming that fact is not disputed, assuming there's no dispute there, then that may demonstrate the plan to reactor vessel. At least that coupon is good enough for 60 years. The reason I hedge is, well, you had a coupon, but the vessel is huge. Well, you're telling me the coupon will survive for 60 years. Well, the question remains to be asked, is the coupon representative of the vessel, or is it just something happened to be the strongest? I mean, when you get that coupon 40 years ago, right, who observed selecting of that coupon? Are there any things that may happen to your vessel while it's being constructed? Right? I mean, I am, belong to the old school, like President Reagan said, trust but verify. None of this question and inquiry has nothing to do with saying somebody may have done something wrong. I'm just saying, let us make sure that, well, I'm persuaded the coupon will survive for 60 years of operating, right? Because it has been demonstrated. But does it mean the vessel would too? Right? Is there anything else that may come into play? That I, for one, have no expertise. Somebody who had expertise in material, in testing, in manufacturing, need to come in and provide further examination of this important issue.
Thank you.
I appreciate the chair bearing with me on my waxing philosophical here, but I think we're right at 3:50, and Let's take our break. It's a 10-minute break.
Yes, 10-minute break,
and we
4
will come back right at 4 o'clock, do our final panel, and then at the end of that, open up for a wrap-up and public